Well, welcome back, everyone. We will proceed with the next session for today's conference, which is going to be focused on issues involving housing and spatial segregation. If you happen to be just joining us, just a reminder that today's conference is dedicated to examining the 125th anniversary of the historic Plessy versus Ferguson decision. There is, you're hearing from the authors of manuscripts that are included in a special volume of the Russell Sage Foundation Journal of Social Sciences. We also include that link in the chat, and all of these manuscripts are accessible at no charge. They are free. So for this session, we are pleased to be joined by 4 panelists. Each of them have looked at an essay that interrogates the questions related to housing and spatial segregation, and in particularly thinking about the legacy of Plessy versus Ferguson in these areas.
Yeah. So thank you for this opportunity to participate. So my colleagues, Dr. Tia Gaynor and Brian Williams couldn't make it, but so I'll be representing them. And so since we only have 5 minutes, so we wanted to look at the ripple effects of Plessy versus Ferguson in the context of policing. And so through Plessy versus Ferguson, we sort of engaged in the discussion of the political social conditions, specifically so the inequitable access to quality public education, public housing, which inevitably spiraled into problems of higher poverty, crime, both over-policing and under-policing of African-American communities. And therefore, we sort of wanted to see how segregation and high crime, how did this fuse with already pre-existing negative social constructions of criminality based on race, which again led to effects of disproportionate criminalization and incarceration of Black communities. And so our question was, what were the long-term effects of residential segregation in the context of policing? And so we looked at the notion of Black spaces, which were largely composed of African-American residents, and how did this lead to a disproportionate number of Black persons killed by law enforcement? And so we drew data from the Mapping Police Violence, which focuses on the 100 largest US cities. We created a panel data set, which is sort of limited. I know we're talking about a long-term effects, but due to data limitations, we could only focus on the years 2013 to 2018. And so based on our analyses, we found that, so we conducted both descriptive statistics and panel data regression, where based on a rate per population, police homicides of Black population was 2.05 times higher than any other racial group. So we found that no other racial group exceeded a value of 1, whereas 2.5, the rate for the Black population was 2.05. So basically it's saying that the rate was 2 times higher than any other racial group. And so we also conducted panel data regression over controlling for poverty, violent crime, murder rates, et cetera, where Black spaces defined as a higher Black population, as well as a higher Black-white dissimilarity significantly correlated with higher rates, higher homicides of Black persons by police. So I know that it was sort of a broader approach where a lot of historical forces have converged to create such state of sort of reality, but our sort of direct implications was that in order to engage in the reform of law enforcement, it requires an understanding, sort of the historical understanding, acknowledgement of the historical legacy and practices of the police profession as instruments of state-sanctioned violence and social control, and how this still affects the perceptions of participation of Black communities in sort of collaborative and cooperation, problem solving, and co-production and so forth. Sorry, I'm using a lot of broad language here, but in order to look at different aspects of judicial procedures, changes to police practices and all that, we sort of wanted to sort of have sort of the historical approach, right? So historical understanding is what created these conditions to lead to such results. And so considering time, so one, I guess, sort of hope was that we found that an increase in the percentage of Black officers in police agencies predicted a decrease in the number of police killings. And so that was sort of something that we hope to build upon for the future, where representative bureaucracy is a well-researched area, but again, something that's hopefully could provide some hope where that aspect of reform we could build upon that to engage in some additional changes and things like that. And so Okay, I sort of rushed through, but yeah. So thank you, and I guess we'll move on to the next professor. Yeah. So.
Thank you so much. Professor Ware.
Yes, good afternoon, or here and I guess morning elsewhere. But thanks for including me in this very stimulating discussion on Plessy. Plessy, cast, in my view, a very long shadow, which is still reverberating today. And one of the things it did was to create these two Americas, one black, one white, separate and quite unequal. And so not enough attention, I think, has been given to housing patterns and the long-standing and severe impacts of the government's role in the development and implementation of segregation in housing. And I'll kind of fast forward it to the late 1930s when the FHA and VA invented a device called redlining. And redlining was one of these so-called security maps that broke up cities into neighborhoods and ranked them A through D. And D neighborhoods were the neighborhoods where African Americans lived. A red line was drawn on these maps, and lenders were not allowed to lend there. And beginning in the post-war era, when the suburbs were invented, first of all, they couldn't have existed or been constructed without VA and FHA insured loans. And so the suburbs grew by millions of housing units in the 1950s and 60s. And the house, the Levittown house that cost $2,000 then is now worth $400,000. So African Americans, though, were specifically and categorically excluded by government fiat, and the government required racially restrictive covenants in the deed. So that created the all-white suburbs that we know or have known, and the sort of the inner city Black communities to which Blacks were confined. So that happened. So Blacks were denied the intergenerational wealth transfers that provided from the late 1940s through 1968, when the Fair Housing Act was enacted, and even after that, because it was a relatively weak act. So that is the damage that was done. The other aspect of it was that segregated neighborhoods made it almost impossible to integrate schools because they were located in different districts. And a Supreme Court case held that the suburban districts could not be included in any school desegregation plans. So that built on and these issues. So the two other things that the government did was the creation of the interstate highway system, which destroyed hundreds of Black neighborhoods and promoted segregation by using the highways as boundaries between Black and white neighborhoods. So that happened starting in the mid-1960s. And even after the Fair Housing Act of 1968, local municipalities used zoning to exclude African Americans from those neighborhoods. So that's why the circumstance exists today. So in the last perhaps 25 years or so, African Americans have in large numbers been moving to suburban communities. So the new suburbs, the ones that are maybe 25 years or less, are relatively mixed, whereas the old kind of inner city communities are still highly segregated. And if you look at what's called a dissimilarity map that you can look at online at Census-Scope, you can see that the 50 largest cities in America are what social scientists describe as highly segregated. So that persists into the present, and it is responsible for example, the net worth disparities between Black and white families based on, again, so before, just to kind of go a little bit out of line, whites were basically working class and upper class before World War II. but they became the middle class by virtue of the federal subsidies for housing. And they represent or created in those years the new white middle class. But again, Blacks were excluded, and that accounts for the net worth differentials that persist today. And so just to conclude, I can take a plane to any city in America and jump in a cab or an Uber and say, take me to the Black neighborhood. And he or she will take me there, no questions asked. So segregation persists. It adversely affects Blacks. And to make it worse, actually, is the middle class African-American families moved, left behind the poor, most distressed communities. So they suffer, those families are perhaps in a worse situation in terms of potential for upward mobility than their grandparents were in 1950. So these disparities persist. And just to add to the school situation, one thing I would think should be mentioned is that the discipline disparities in schools are off the chart. So just because Blacks and whites are in the same schools doesn't mean they get equal access to equal educational opportunities. They're kicked out, thrown out, and the vibes between the teachers and students are simply horrible. So we're still living very much every day, day in, day out, with the vestiges of segregation. And I think I'll stop there since I don't know what time it is.
Thank you so much. Professor Reece.
Thank you, Dr. Gooden. My paper explores two cases where we utilized an engagement process and curriculum focused on the history of structural racism in real estate, development, and the built environment to engage policymakers in Columbus and Cleveland, Ohio, around policy reforms to support racial equity. My case specifically explores how we can structure and utilize this history to move policymakers into being more proactive and assertive in supporting policies that engage racial equity, particularly around housing and the built environment. Our engagement process was centered on a curriculum that demonstrated the complex and resilient ways racism was embedded deeply into the core of our housing system. And referring to Professor Powell's analogy in his opening remarks, how the pathogen of racism in housing would continually mutate and reassert itself in response to civil rights legislation or court decisions. Our curriculum focused on the forms of racial expulsive and exclusionary zoning, covenants, redlining, urban renewal, federal highway programs, a history that Professor Ware compellingly puts forth in his chapter in this special issue as well. A key element of this was reading real historical texts, engaging personal histories from folks who had lived through some of these experiences, and also bringing in historical photography, which many of our participants that were elected officials in particular noted shifted our conversations from abstract history to real concrete impacts in terms of how they perceive these policies impacting the community longitudinally. Policymakers in particular, in evaluating the outcomes of this process, were most moved by analysis which demonstrated the alignment of historical spatial racism in many of the contemporary community challenges that they were wrestling with. So for example, in Cleveland, historically redlined neighborhoods had a subprime lending rate of almost 60% right before the 2008 housing market crash. Infant mortality rates today were 800% higher in formerly redlined neighborhoods. And these areas had the lowest life expectancies and the highest rates of lead poisoning. And many of these kind of contemporary challenges that agencies and elected officials were working on within the context of these neighborhoods were not historically grounded in the ways that structural racism helped create many of the risks as well as conditions within those communities today. My evaluation of the process demonstrated that this form of engagement can energize efforts to center racial equity within organizations and broader policy agendas. Our participants noted that the process challenged the limitations of kind of a value neutrality in policymaking, and recognize that if policies are not centered around racial equity, then they are propagating an existing racist development system that is decades, if not a century old. Participants also emphasized that the process helped shift perspectives on policy interventions to be less individualized, more systemic, and specifically thinking about how to align efforts across institutions. And from a policy perspective, there were a number of very kind of specific policy and investment efforts that were started in these communities that was informed by this historical engagement process. So I'll close by just stating, I guess, a proposition. In many ways, this work occurred 4 or 5 years ago, before some of the data tools that are out there today, such as the University of Richmond's redlining database, some of the work of folks such as Rothstein's A Color of Law. And in many ways, this was a labor-intensive process because we were kind of developing this history. Now we have these histories that are being developed and presented and made accessible all across the country. And so my challenge is really to think about how we can more deliberately engage our policymakers, engage the general public, and engage our systems around this history of structural racism in the development system as we seek to try to reimagine what a 21st century development system could look like, our real estate system could look like, that was centered around racial equity and not racial exclusion. So thank you, and look forward to our dialogue after the other presenters speak.
Thank you so much, Professor Reece. And rounding out this session will be a presentation from Professor Smith.
Good afternoon, folks. Indeed, I'm Robert Smith. I want to make sure to acknowledge my co-author, Dr. Paru Shah, and her work as a political scientist, and she looks at the important efforts around the Black electorate. And so we bring our lenses together for this project. What we argue in very somewhat general, but then also specific terms are the following. One is that voter ID laws are indeed blatant efforts to disfranchise not only minority populations, but political opponents. And we see the overwhelming majority, all of the voter ID laws are coming out of Republican-leaning legislatures. The second point we want to make is that not only are these blatant efforts to disfranchise, that as much as this conversation about Plessy is important around race neutrality and color blindness, what were once a set of colorblind voter ID laws are not at all anymore, and if at best are barely colorblind and race neutral. And then the third point, extending from the fellow panelists with me here, is that indeed we see the impact of residential segregation and its impact in shaping of racial geographies playing very important roles in what we look at as the political geographies of urban and suburban America. And so as we begin our conversation, as I begin my portion of it, in 1896, we know that Plessy leads us into this era of separate but equal, and it is also the 1890s where we witness the extraordinarily violent removal of African Americans from the political process across the South. And so I think it's important for us to not only think about the specific nature of Plessy and its role, but then also the era out of which Plessy emerges. And it is indeed that broader context that I think we are still grappling with, not only the question of segregation, but the overarching impact of what we broadly refer to as white supremacy from the moment. And so for our purposes, we looked at voter ID laws, and we were specific to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, because Milwaukee plays a central role in so many of the issues that many of us have talked about today. It is like many urban areas, it's rigidly segregated. There's hyper policing. We can pick certain zip codes where we see large numbers of folks being incarcerated. And it also battles some very challenging economic woes. And so the socioeconomic divides are critical here as well. So when we get into our conversation around voter ID laws, we use a local district court opinion to help explore the conversation, because the lower opinion from Judge Adelman really does a wonderful job of deconstructing any arguments supporting voter ID laws. And so out of that, district court opinion, we ultimately then looked into some of the other cases that helped to shape the legal environment around voter ID laws. The key case out of Indiana, Crawford v. Marion County. And what we determined are the following. And I think many of us know this about voter ID laws, specifically coming off a recent election, right? These were a very clearly a part of our conversation here in the late portions of last year. And we've seen what has occurred across the country with legislatures and their efforts to further disfranchise. So first and foremost, voter ID laws operate both as a version of a modern day poll tax because of the costs associated with voter ID laws in a city like ours, economic challenges being what they are. It can be very difficult and challenging for folks to have the resources to get the necessary IDs to then cast a meaningful vote or to vote, to register to vote. Indeed, if you already have the appropriate ID, you're grandfathered in. It operates with the vestiges of grandfathering. And then also there's some very real literacy related questions associated with an ID requirement. And so if we think about the voter IDs as these laws and the application of them as harbingers of the Plessy era, we see very clearly the remnants of those disfranchising mechanisms built into the voter ID laws. We also have to really emphasize the importance of this question of colorblindness. What were a set of laws 10 years ago or 12 years ago around the emergence of voter ID laws that maybe did not specify race. By the time we get to the voter ID law here in Wisconsin several years ago, it's very much the case that race is a part of the construction of the law and the application of the law. The language coming from the legislature is that felons might commit voter fraud, immigrants might commit voter fraud. And you read those obviously as Black and Latino voters, right? And so the impact of the language that has informed the voter ID laws has moved from something that was, we might consider barely race neutral or barely colorblind to a set of policies that are overwhelmingly shaped by racial ideologies, racial imageries, and in some cases, blatant racism. And the last point I'll make here is that when we think about, as my colleagues mentioned before, the legacies of residential segregation, the impact of racial geographies, this plays out in the ways that our political house is divided along urban and suburban America. And then we weave into the realities of voter ID laws, the socioeconomic disparities associated with that longstanding history of residential segregation. And then we are also forced to think about the political hostility that is directed at urban communities as a result of how those spaces have become racialized, both in terms of geography, but then also in our racial imaginations. And so voter ID laws are indeed harbingers, not only of Plessy versus Ferguson specifically in reference to the progeny that has emerged as a result of residential segregation, but they are also reflective of a set of attitudes from the Plessy era in general, because of the ways they look to disfranchise using race as a central axis in that process. Thank you all very much.
Thank you to each of our panelists. We have about 5 minutes left in this session. I wanted to pose a question and ask each of the panelists to respond briefly to this. Is that one cross-cutting theme across each of your presentations is the role of the state and the role of government. And we could, if you wanted to be, I guess, quite generous, we could call this state-caused inequities, or we could call it state-sanctioned racism. And so you talked about representative bureaucracy and policing and the FHA and interstate highway system and voting. All of these things relate back to governmental policies, particularly at the state level. And one of the things I think with Plessy is that we saw an elevation of the 10th Amendment relative to states' rights and states having an elevated role in terms of policymaking. So could each of you talk a bit about in your areas, the path forward relative to holding governments accountable for these outcomes?
Well, right now, government is the problem. The movements by states to limit voting, the voter suppression schemes. So the states are indeed the problem. And it doesn't look like we can look for too much help from federal courts. So the way forward will simply be to fight back against the disenfranchising moves and the efforts to minimize. Now, it is one change, I guess, is you saw in Georgia the combination of middle-class African Americans and more progressive whites kind of getting together. And I think because the suburbs are becoming more diverse, the efforts to suppress, I don't think will be as useful as the Republicans think.
Yeah, I guess I just 1 minute statement. So in the context of policing, I think we've seen this played out for the past year. So sort of, it's a difficult, I think, state of affairs. You know, there's conversation about the pros and cons of defunding the police. What does that entail? Things like that. But I think moving forward, it is very difficult. I think that there has to be a balance between yes, there needs to be balancing for public safety. You know, there's crime is an issue, but at the same time, how do we ensure that there is sort of just police practices? And so that's something I guess we'll have to see in the future. I think it's an ongoing event that it's kind of difficult to say, here's what will happen. So hopefully, you know, hopefully it'll sort of progress in a positive way. So, yeah.
And, you know, I'll jump in real quickly. Yeah, I agree, Professor Ware. There's not much we can count on regarding our so-called political leadership. I am more inspired by what I've seen here in this state, which is a remarkable set of coalitions around protecting the right to vote. Massive dissemination of educational materials, regular updates on pending legislation, which then has allowed for some pressure to be applied to elected officials. In some cases, these are advocates from the nonprofit sector. In other cases, they might have the folks involved in these coalitions might be directly related to the voting mechanisms in some ways or another. And so there is, I think, an important set of collaborations from folks who are a part of grassroots efforts, and then also those folks who are a little bit more connected to the political process that might lend us a window of success and bend a little bit of that political sphere toward a more democratic outcome.
I guess I am, you know, I think from the federal level, the importance of really taking the affirmatively furthering fair housing requirement of the 68 Civil Rights Act or Fair Housing Act is still really critical. We missed a golden opportunity in the early 70s to better align, particularly from a development perspective, where our resources were going from the federal government, which still today funds most of our big picture infrastructure, with goals of integration in the housing market. So I hold some hope there, but I've also been probably mostly energized through these local processes, actually, watching coalitions form around new laws around housing rights, which really would have been unthinkable 10 or 15 years ago. We've now had at least a half dozen suburbs voluntarily enact source of income protections, for example, for Section 8 households. And that has been in response to grassroots efforts within those communities pushing for those reforms. So I think, you know, it is very frustrating from the federal perspective, what we've dealt with in recent history, as well as our more longitudinal view of that history. But I do have hope in that, you know, some form of local activism and better alignment of federal resources could break some of these patterns that have been so persistent.
All right, well, thanks to each of our panelists for your very insightful presentations and thought-provoking analysis. We will now take a 5-minute break, and when we return, we will have our concluding session, which will include a presentation from the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation. So we look to see you back in 5 minutes. Thank you.